I know what you are feeling. I am feeling it too, along with millions of people around the world. We all share this one thing in common during this uncertain time in our lives, and you may be surprised to know the underlying reason for it. But first, let me guess. Most days, you are waking up filled with a sense of hope and gratitude, and a few hours later, you are in disbelief, discomfort, lack of focus, and your heart is racing, and you just feel flat out frustrated. But then as the day goes on, a sense of calm begins to fill you, and you begin to accept this new reality, this new normal. For starters, there is nothing wrong with you, all right? Let's get that out of the way right now. Take a deep breath and know that you are okay, and this thing that you are going through will pass when you allow yourself the grace, patience, and time that you need. What you, myself, and millions of fellow humans are facing at this very moment in time is grief. We are all going through the grieving process. We are all grieving the death of normalcy and life before the pandemic. It's scary, it is uncertain, and we are just trying to take it one day at a time, right? And once you've put a name to what it is that you are feeling, it tends to make the process a little bit easier. However, it's still a long journey ahead. And as David Kessler suggests, and he says that the process of grieving is not a linear process, meaning the 5 stages of grief that I'm going to mention here in a second, they are not going to happen in a linear process. How I have gone through my own personal process of grieving after losing my mom and my battle with anxiety, and now the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be very unique to me, and it's going to be very different for you. Okay, that is very important to understand. And as I give you the steps and guidance that David Kessler shares in his article and in his book, I'm going to kind of give my own personal insight on these things as well. Many people believe that grief is something you experience only after you lose a loved one. Now, even though the death of a loved one is one of the primary ways that you will go through the grieving process in your life, it is not the only way that you will experience grief in your lifetime. Grief, as David Kessler suggests, is the death of something. It is not only the death of a loved one, which is obviously the most monumental and devastating experience that anyone will go through. Grief is also experienced when you have a death of a marriage, also a divorce, death of a pet, loss of a job, when a lot of folks experience an empty nest syndrome. But something that you, myself, and millions of people around the world are experiencing right now is the death of normalcy. We are grieving for the way things used to be. Our world has completely changed, and the old world as we knew it once is now no more. And we are slowly stepping into a new world. Life before COVID-19 was drastically different than life that is about to happen during and then after COVID-19. And that is what you are experiencing, that is what I am experiencing, and that is what millions of people around the world are experiencing, and that is grief. And when I read this article in the Harvard Business Review written by David Kessler, it was a light bulb moment, and followed up with his conversation that he had with Dan Harris of the 10% Happier podcast, one of my favorite podcasts. As I was listening to that podcast after reading this article, it's just a lot of light bulb moments were happening. So I highly suggest and recommend you listen to that podcast episode. I will link it in the show notes, but I'm going to give you my own insight on how I digested this article and the podcast after I listened to it, and why it's really important for you as well. Now, I've experienced grief 2 times in my life. The first time being, as I've shared numerous times on this channel and on my podcast, is after losing my mom to breast cancer at a very young age. After I lost my mother, I started experiencing very monumental emotions that I had never experienced before in my lifetime. These were devastating. These were scary. I remember numerous times waking up in the middle of the night just bawling my eyes out. I was 13 at the time, and I remember trying to cope with the idea that I have lost the one person in my life who made me feel safe and secure. Now, of course, my father, my siblings, and those very close to me made me feel safe. But the love of a mother and how a mother makes you feel in regards to that warmth and that comfort and that safety is on a whole different level. And for the moms listening, you know what I'm talking about. And for the children listening, if you have your parents who are alive or may have passed, unfortunately, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I remember there was a day that I was at a playground a few months after she had passed away, and I was still going through the process of digesting and figuring out what had happened, this huge shift in my life. I remember in the playground just collapsing on the pavement and just bursting into tears. And my brothers ran up to me and they picked me up and they embraced me and they started crying as well. And I went through the grieving process just as my siblings had. And what was really interesting is my journey through the grieving process after losing mom was completely different than the journey that my siblings were going through. And that's something really important to note that Kessler also mentions in his book and in the article, is that the grieving process is not linear, meaning the 5 stages of grief that you're going to go through are going to shift every single day. One day you will go from one phase to another, and another day you're going to just take a few steps back. It's a constantly evolving thing, but also it's a completely unique thing. The uniqueness of grieving is as unique as your fingerprints. Okay, so that's really important to know. So how you're grieving right now through the death of normalcy and grieving through figuring out what has just happened, how life has shifted during this pandemic, your experience is going to be completely different. Now, you may have been laid off, you may have lost a family member, you may have been diagnosed with this virus. Now, again, your experience is going to be completely unique than mine, and so what you're going through is different than me. So the second time that I experienced grief in my personal life is in 2015, when I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder, when I started having panic attacks, when I started experiencing anxiety to the extreme. I've been an anxious person since I was a kid, but anxiety did not take over my life until it was 2015, when everything just came rushing in and I started experiencing multiple scary, horrific panic attacks every single day. And at that time, I didn't know what was happening, but I started going through the grieving process again because, again, going back to the death of normalcy, I all of a sudden started questioning everything. I started trying to figure out what the heck is going on in my life. Why me? Why me? Why me? Why is this happening to me? And rationalizing and bargaining and being depressed, obviously linked to anxiety, and being frustrated, and then accepting that this is my new reality. But then a week later, going back into the bargaining stage of grief, which I will talk about the phases here in a second. And so that death of normalcy for me and grieving through the old life for me at that time is very similar to what we're going through right now. How things have changed. The way the world is now is completely different than it was a couple months ago. A couple months ago, we were living our life happily, with no worries, with no stressors. We could go out and do whatever we wanted. We could spend as much time as we wanted with our family. We could go to concerts. We could go to events. We could travel the world. We can get on planes. We can go grocery shopping. We can go do anything we wanted. We can go to gyms, which is something I miss a lot. All those things have now shifted. We can't do any of those things, and we can't do those things until slowly life goes into a new direction. And we don't know what that direction is going to be, but it's going to happen in the next few months, possibly the next year. We don't know how long this is going to take. So those are the 2 times that I experienced grief in my life, and now this is the 3rd time that I'm experiencing grief. I find myself pacing back and forth. I find myself questioning what is going on in the world, going through the different stages of grief. And so let's run through those. And what David Kessler does brilliantly in this article, and then also on Dan Harris's podcast, is he breaks down the stages of grief and links it to how we are experiencing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to do that as well. Now, I do want to mention that the stages of grief were developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which is someone who worked closely with David Kessler to write a book on the stages of grief. And I'm going to read directly what Kubler-Ross wrote and kind of explain to you the different phases of grief if you do not know what they are, which more than likely you know what the phases of grief are, but in case you don't, let's run through them. But I'm going to read this directly. The Kubler-Ross model, or the 5 stages of grief, postulates a series of emotions experienced by terminally ill patients prior to death or people who have lost a loved one. And by the way, quick reminder that after Kubler-Ross wrote this and David Kessler is suggesting this, it's not just the loss of a loved one, it is the loss of many things: loss of a job, a loss of a marriage, like I said, through divorce, and then again, loss of normalcy, which we are all going through right now. So I'm going to share with you how I went through the grieving process through anxiety in 2015 when I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder after a series of panic attacks, okay? So the first stage of the grieving process is denial. So when I started having panic attacks and I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder, denial for me was, this cannot be possibly happening to me. Why me? Why me? Why me? I was completely fine. I was living my life just with no worries, no tension, no stressors, and all of a sudden, I'm having anxiety attacks, I'm having panic attacks, and I'm going through depression. This cannot possibly be happening. I'm probably just dreaming. This is not real. That's the first stage. The second stage is anger. I was so frustrated. I was so angry at myself and at the world. How could this possibly be happening to someone who is living a life that is only getting started for them? I was so frustrated. I was thinking to myself, my life is only getting started. I have so many things I want to do in my life. I felt like my life was coming to an end because this was such a drastic shift than what I was used to, that I was angry, I was hostile towards myself, just, being extremely frustrated and not knowing what it is that's happening to me at that time. The third stage is bargaining. And so what I was going through at that time was bargaining with my anxiety, saying, okay, so today you get to have full control of what you want to do, but tomorrow you do not get to stick around. Tomorrow is an anxiety-free zone. I'm going to live my day like I used to. I'm going to go back to how things used to be. Today, anxiety, your hair, panic attacks, your hair, but tomorrow, not so much. And what would happen the next day? My anxiety would be worse because I was putting way too much pressure on my anxiety. And so if you go back and watch my video or listen to the podcast where I share my anxiety story, I share very powerful tips and tools that I started developing over the years when I started figuring out how to manage my anxiety in a very healthy way. And that is what helped me really get through the final stages that I'm going to share in a second. But I was trying to bargain with my anxiety, which is a big no-no because you cannot bargain with something that is a part of you. You have to figure out how to handle it in a healthy way. But I didn't know at that time how to handle it in a healthy way. The fourth stage is depression. Anxiety, depression, very much linked together. But this is when I would bargain with my anxiety and the next day would be worse, and then I would fall into a depression just thinking my life was over. Staring at the ceiling while my heart was racing, my chest was just like pulsating, and I just was like so frustrated and just felt so sad in my own little world. I'm laughing about it right now, not in a way to make light of the situation, but just how interesting it is, how life changes, and how you get through things and get past things and push through things and come out on the other side stronger. But when you're in it, it seems so scary that you don't know how to get out of it, such as right now with COVID-19. And the fifth and final stage of grieving that Kubler-Ross and Kessler wrote together on is acceptance. Accepting that this is part of your life, but not accepting in a way that you're giving up, saying, okay, whatever, putting your hands up, this is acceptance, this is part of my life now, but rather acceptance of allowing that thing to be a part of you and knowing that this is your new normal. The old world, the old normal that used to be is no longer around. This is your new normal, and this is how life is going to be. And that's acceptance. And that's how Kubler-Ross and Kessler wrote out the stages of grief to really help people figure out what it is that they're going through. Again, not a linear process. As I mentioned, one day I would be depressed, and the next day I was bargaining with my anxiety, and the following day I would accept it, that this is my new normal, and then I would be angry the following day. So a lot of things are happening. You're really developing and figuring yourself out. Now, let's talk about how the grieving process is linked to COVID-19. Denial. I cannot believe this is happening in our modern society. There's no way this should be happening to us in our world right now. Anger. Really? Are you serious? I can't go out. I can't do the things I've always been able to do freely? Bargaining. Okay, let me get this straight. If I stay home for 2 weeks, then everything goes back to normal, right? That's the deal? Depression. Wait, this could go on longer? Are you kidding? This is so sad. Acceptance. All right, this is our new reality. What can I do to make this work? Something to note here, and this is something that Kessler mentioned in his article and on Dan Harris's podcast, is the majority of people, once they've gone through the stages of grief, they will go through PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And instead of stressing out through this traumatic experience, something that Kessler recommended that I had never heard of before, instead of talking about post-traumatic stress, going through a stressful period of time after a traumatic event, and grieving is a traumatic event in itself, and the process of grieving and why you're grieving is a traumatic event. But instead of going through a traumatic event after the case, why don't we do a post-traumatic growth period? Meaning you have to grow through it, you have to go through it, and you have to grow bigger than the grieving itself. You have to grow bigger than what it was that you were going through. And so what Kessler has decided to do in his new book that's coming out, and something he mentioned in the article, is a 6th stage of grief that was never mentioned by Kubler-Ross, something that Kessler has now written on through his own experience after losing his son when his son was only 21 years old. And the 6th stage is meaning, finding meaning in what it is that you just went through. Now, of course, finding meaning after losing a loved one is very difficult, and it's not going to happen overnight. And this is something Kessler mentions again. He says meaning is not something you're going to say, oh, it was in the top drawer. It was here all along. I found meaning to why this particular grieving process happened for me, right? So if you lose a loved one, if you lost someone very close to you, finding meaning in that is very difficult. It's not going to happen overnight. As a matter of fact, it's not going to happen in a year. It's going to take a long time for you to understand and realize what the meaning behind that absolutely horrific, scary time in your life was. For me, it took me a few years to figure out the meaning of my anxiety disorder. And after reading Kessler's piece and him talking about meaning, it all made sense to me. For me, even though it was difficult going through my anxiety disorder, it finally took some time to realize after a few years that the meaning behind it, the reason I was going through anxiety, was so I can utilize my own personal growth and the process that I went through, as scary as it was, to help others through that difficult time. And now I'm so grateful and honored to talk through and help so many amazing human beings around the world through their own anxiety disorders and depression and panic attacks. Through my voice, through the podcast, through my YouTube channel, I've gotten just countless messages of people saying that they've listened to my story, they've listened to everything I'm sharing, and I've given them hope that they never knew would be possible. For me, that's the meaning of my own death of normalcy after going through anxiety disorder and finding a new purpose in life and a new meaning for myself through the new world. So COVID-19, the pandemic we're going through, what is the meaning of all of this? And as we go through the stages of grief, back and forth through our own non-linear process, through our own unique journey through this grief that we are experiencing right now, how do we get to the 6th stage as Kessler recommends? Well, it's not going to happen overnight. And as a matter of fact, it's not going to happen for a few months, and it's probably not going to happen for a year or a couple of years. We are eventually going to understand the meaning behind why it is that we personally went through this pandemic and how we handle this journey of our own grief through this pandemic. And so this feeling that you're feeling, these emotions that you are experiencing on a daily basis through a non-linear process, jumping back and forth from the different stages of grief, accepting it one day and then bargaining the next day with this COVID-19 pandemic, it'll eventually make sense and the meaning will unfold. But you have to give yourself patience and grace and love and know that it will unfold at your own time, at your own tempo, at your own place. And when it does, it'll all make sense. And I'd completely trust Kessler and how he wrote this article and how he's spoken so poetically and beautifully about grief and how we are handling it. So I'm sending you all my love and my grace and my patience, and I am just giving you my virtual hug that we will get through this together. And please be patient and be kind to yourself. This too shall pass. Thank you for listening to this episode if you're listening to the episode version, and thank you for watching the video if you're watching on YouTube. Consider subscribing, share with a friend if this is a message that has profoundly impacted you. And as always, go out there, be amazing, be abundant. I love you, Dost, and we will see you very soon. Thank you, Dost.